So let me begin with a general disclaimer that I'm not an Auden scholar or even an English professor. I'm a classical philologist. So by way of my classical habitus, if you will, as well as one of those public readers who, like many readers of Auden's poem, first came to it when they discovered it in their inbox shortly after 9/11. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach here than my fellow panelists and remark upon the way that I come to the poem as both a specialized trained reader in literary studies as well as a sort of public reader, and raise some issues regarding the interrelationship between literature and its relationship with the public. Let me begin with the issue of intertextuality and literary allusion. Auden's poem, like a lot of his poetry, was really informed by his classical training. He was a classicist in his own right, like many authors of his day, and he too recognized that there was a disjuncture between specialized knowledge and the need by a general public for an introduction to classical literature. And he published a little Greek portable reader to help with that. Still, 75 years ago, classics was a standard in education. And certainly the general and the specialized reader of Auden's time had a much more extensive exposure and grounding in classics than they do today. And we can no longer assume, I think, for any reader, any degree of classical foreknowledge or familiarity, or one that is at least not informed by inaccurate popular culture movies. For me as a classicist, Auden's allusions here, in particular his stanza on Thucydides, and all literary allusions for that matter, raise in my mind an important issue, namely to what degree does a lack or even possession of cultural capital on the part of a reader have on a reader's dialogue with a poem? That is, to what degree are meaning or irony diluted without a clear understanding of literary allusions and how they may be functioning in a piece of literature? And I realize it's somewhat of a prosaic question, but it's one that I think is particularly relevant given the way in which the internet and other media outlets disseminate literature broadly and efficiently. In other words, the public and the general reader are being exposed to literature that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have read. I'm not sure that I can say I would have read Auden without 9/11. And this has been precisely facilitated by technological advances. And given what I see as a broader dissemination of literature in public contexts that involve a non-specialized reader, the question of cultural capital and what it brings to bear on literature and one's interaction with literature becomes increasingly important. I think particularly in classrooms where we deal with students of diverse backgrounds and diverse literary experiences. On what level does a general reader interact with literature that is heavily laden with literary allusions? Historically, of course, classicists will tell you that it's only through a thorough grounding in the classics can one truly access modern literature, particularly literature that includes intertextual references or classical allusions. Of course, this is clearly a fallacy. But even as early as 1868, Henry Sidgwick, who himself was a prominent classicist and professor of moral philosophy at Cambridge, he challenged the indispensability of classical training. He argued that classical allusions explain themselves or are explained by the context, and any other incomprehensible allusions can be picked up from, and I quote, a good course in English literature. Or, as the case may be today, from textual footnotes, or more likely perhaps from SparkNotes or Wikipedia. And of course, this is not necessarily a good thing since these things tend to be inaccurate. More interestingly, however, he argued that even without an understanding of classical allusions, or literary allusions in general, a general reader can still interact with a text, entering into its feelings, its emotions. Is this enough? It brings us back to some of the questions I think raised yesterday regarding the social function of literary studies in terms of aesthetic pleasure. And for classics, this issue regarding a reader's interaction with the text on a social level raises issues regarding not only the social function of classics, why are we teaching it and how can we convince our students it's a useful enterprise, but how can classics fit into a modern world and a modern university that increasingly focuses on internationalization and globalization? At my own institution, for example, classics has recently been folded into a new school of languages, cultures, and world affairs, essentially a school of modern languages where globalization is the focus. And thus we don't quite fit there, but we don't quite belong back in humanities and social sciences where languages aren't taught. So we're having a bit of an identity crisis at my institution, having to reconsider exactly where we fit, and this is indeed a microcosm for, I think, a larger issue that the discipline of classics is dealing with. The notion of the public's or the general reader's relationship with literature and the social function of literature in general is really an outcome of the new ways in which literature is broadly and efficiently disseminated to the public within public contexts. This is particularly true for Auden's poem, which, as Jonathan has already noted, became a centerpiece in numerous media outlets post 9/11. And I wonder, to what degree is it a useful or healthy exercise to evoke literature in public context when a poem's meaning or its aesthetic pleasure or its social function or whatever it may be dependent in part on an understanding of its literary allusions? Is it enough for a reader to interact with a literary text on only the level of emotions and feelings if those emotional responses are communicated in part by the literary allusions that help shape and create them? Several points have already been raised about the utility of literature and modern society and how the former can shed light on the latter, which is what we see happening perhaps in some interpretations of Auden's poem after 9/11. But I would say too that the reverse is true, that modern society can be used as a lens for interpreting the literary text. It's a way to reinvigorate literature and the public's relationship with it. We've seen this as a new trend in classics, also in the 9/11 context and war, whereby, for some example, scholars are reinvestigating the Catilinarian conspiracy as a terrorist attack on Rome, and other scholars are reconsidering Homer and Euripides in light of post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet, these kinds of investigations are generally occurring in more general magazines such as The Economist, and there seems to be a disconnect between the so-called professional intellect in which the academic steps outside of the academy and contributes to news magazines or public radio, and there's clearly value attached to this, but in the same sense, the value does not really necessarily equate to scholarship within the academy. It's difficult for me when I approach this poem to take off my classicist cap and approach it neutrally to understand how maybe a general or non-specialized reader might read it. And in my mind, I don't think the references to Thucydides are completely self-explanatory. Perhaps the general reader may know that Thucydides wrote a history on the Peloponnesian War and included Pericles' famous funeral oration. But does the reader understand how the ironic interplay between Thucydides' skepticism of democracy and the encomiastic words he places in the mouth of Pericles may contribute to any interpretation or interaction of the poem, and how Auden may or may not be aligning himself with the ancient historian in light of similar political and social contexts? Does the general reader understand that Auden's reference to dictators may call to mind, for a classicist anyway, Cleon and Alcibiades and other Athenian demagogues who elsewhere in Thucydides' text he levies criticism against? Do these points of reference matter to a reader's enjoyment or aesthetic pleasure of the poem? I think this perhaps raises a much more loaded question, and one that I think other people have brought up, namely, does literature, especially literature that contains numerous erudite allusions, privilege a certain class of readers, social and economic? And how do we reconcile this status discrepancy with a need and a desire to renew interest in and justify the value of literature among general readers? This is certainly a question that classics is grappling with on a very real level, as the inability to attract students to classics courses means not just reduced budgets, but literally the life or death of some programs, particularly the recent collapse of the classics program at Michigan State University, which is now the only Big Ten university that does not have a classics program anymore. These questions regarding the relationship between literature and the public or the general reader raise a larger issue for me in terms of the dangers of literary appropriation or intertextuality. I've seen a growing trend, again, no doubt facilitated by the easy access to literature via the internet, of appropriating literature and specific quotes for purely social or visual purposes. Nowadays, readers have at their disposal WikiQuote or other online search engines that allow them to find a quote that sounds good for a paper or a rhetorical speech. This echoes yesterday's comments regarding a growing danger of simply searching a text rather than reading it. I think for classicists, this is particularly a problem since Latin and Greek still carry a gravitas that makes the general public very attracted to appropriating quotes without understanding their original historical and literary context, much less what the Latin or Greek actually says. And every semester, I'd say I get at least one request from a perfect stranger, at least one, to confirm the accuracy or inaccuracy of a Latin or Greek quote that this person plans on tattooing onto their body. It's an incredibly trendy thing right now, Latin and Greek tattoos, probably perpetuated in part by Angelina Jolie. And you know, this has gone beyond, I think as President Broad had mentioned yesterday, beyond Bobby Kennedy's merely quoting from Euripides. You know, an audience then probably understood the references and could appreciate them. These emails that I get, I answer them rather grudgingly. I think it's a sense of duty to the authors that I work on. But really, I see it as symptomatic of a larger issue about how literature continues to be filtered throughout the public, particularly through the hijacking of quotes, exploited for their gravitas, but without real appreciation or understanding of the literary context or the literary significance of the quote. And it's not just public contexts that are guilty of this practice. My own institution, the College of Charleston, is the 13th oldest institute of higher learning in the country, which means it's deeply steeped in the classics tradition, and classics is still housed in the original building on campus, which is often the site for many a movie production. And yet on campus there is this wrought iron gate through which students and faculty pass daily, rather symbolically, with a literary quote at its apex taken from Aeneid, Book 1. Forsane taikolem meminissa juabit. College officials and college handbooks will translate the quote as, "To remember these things will be a pleasure." It's a nice idea. How an institution might want to portray the learning experience to students and parents and future students. In the context, however, I'm sure some of you have already clearly understood, it's rather an inappropriate literary selection, since you may recall Aeneas speaks this to his comrades immediately following a near decimating shipwreck that nearly destroys all the Trojans, and he also mentions it in context to the other challenges that they have just overcome, namely Scylla, Charybdis, and Cyclops. So of course a more accurate translation is, maybe one day even these things will be a pleasure to remember. Which clearly is a much more pessimistic outlook on the college experience, and perhaps maybe a more accurate representation of one's college career. And of course, by the way, I'm well aware of the irony in practicing an intertextual activity, which I'm also currently criticizing. It, in my opinion, reduces an important literary quote in a context to an act of parody. In essence. This kind of misappropriation is increasing at an alarming rate, and much more egregious is the appropriation and evocation of literary quotes and entire literary works as instruments of rhetorical power, particularly in political contexts. Auden's poem has been used in numerous ways since 1939, and to varying degrees of rhetorical manipulation. Lyndon Johnson quoted from it and used it in his campaign. And on the opposite end of the political spectrum, the poem was variously quoted piecemeal by Dan Quayle and George Bush Sr. And after 9/11, the poem was disseminated quickly and broadly through email, blog postings, and the media. And the general public seemed to gravitate towards it precisely, as we've already seen, because of some emotional affiliation it felt with images and words. But can and should literary texts be appropriated by and for a public to push agendas and ideas that may be quite different from the poem's original intent and context? And can and should these texts be appropriated by and for a public who may not possess the cultural capital to understand fully the literary allusions implicit, perhaps, to the poem's meaning or aesthetic effect? I've noticed in particular the habitual practice of right-wing politicians utilizing ancient texts, or rather utilizing their gravitas, I should say, to support political agendas. This is perhaps nothing new, I think, over the last century, but perhaps what is new is a less literary savvy versed public who is now exposed to these often misappropriations. And a great degree of irony and disjuncture are created by a conservative politician's utilization of literary texts that in their original context espoused liberal policies and were written by liberally minded authors. This disjuncture is exasperated by the fact that the resulting irony seems lost upon politicians and often by the general public, a public that in some cases I think is less attuned to literature and its original context. And in my mind, this is a classic example of symbolic violence. And I'm sure many of you have heard about Sarah Palin's use of note cards, and I recently heard an NPR report about the fact that she has a stack of note cards involving references to Thucydides. I'm greatly awaiting her next brilliant speech or interview when she'll pull out those Thucydides references and use them. I'm sure someone out of context. Classicists certainly have a love-hate relationship with the appropriation of literature in these public contexts. On the one hand, anything that publicizes classics and classical texts is a good thing. And yet my fear is that classical texts and literature in general is being reduced to its use as sound bites or as eye candy in pop culture movies like Gladiator and Troy or 300. And again, if this encourages the general reader or student to pick up classical texts and to read them, then all the better. But I find the more likely outcome is that these diluted public forms of literary dissemination are becoming the large part of a student's literary capital that they bring with them into the classroom. And that this isn't even really literary capital, since in many cases they're not actually reading the literature, but it's being disseminated through other pop culture forms like the media and movies. Finally, and this is the last remark I'll make, Auden's poem highlights, I think, a rather interesting interplay among an author, his public, and power. When Auden became dissatisfied with his poem, he attempted to limit its subsequent publications, that is, to control its dissemination among the public. His failure to do so recalls for me Horace and his Ars Poetica, which is a didactic poem on literary production. Here Horace astutely observes to his addressees that it's impossible to delete what hasn't been published, but, quote, a word once let loose can never be recovered. Surely Auden realized this, and clearly there's an interesting power play when a poet loses control over his work, when it can be exploited or appropriated or manipulated by the public. And yet it's the same public, however we define it, whether it's the general public or the intelligentsia, that has power to determine the endurance of a literary work, its survival. Ultimately, it's the public, the reader, sometimes a non-versed reader, who helps to determine an author's literary immortality. And in so doing, in fact, returns power to the author, because literary immortality, I think, is nothing more than power over time. And this is interesting because, not only for me, because Greeks and Romans recognized literary immortality as the chief function of all literary production. And Auden himself seemed to recognize this as in a poem he wrote in honor of Yeats. Also in 1939, the speaker asserts that poetry makes nothing happen, but concomitantly observes the poem's power to survive. Quote, it survives, a way of happening, a mouth. How would Auden feel about the fact that one of his poems he disliked the most is the one which has arguably most solidified his literary immortality for a post-9/11 general reader, as Jonathan also pointed out. This interesting relationship between an author and literary work, the public and power, is relevant, I think, because technology and other media outlets has assumed a central role both in the dissemination of literature and its publicizing of it, and hopefully, too, in renewing interest and drawing new readership to literary works. But it really evokes the question as to whether or not the public, or more specifically the general reader, however we define the general reader, has the cultural capital to interact with literature beyond feelings and emotions, and does this matter? And ultimately, and I'll conclude with this question, which is how do we reconcile the very positive influence the media and technology has in the dissemination of literature to broad audiences with the concomitant contribution to literary misappropriation and misunderstanding? And further, does the general reader need specialized knowledge or training in literature to recognize this contradiction and to enter into a literary work beyond the emotional? Thank you.